Hello. We are together again in the second part of our 16-part documentary, which we prepared to shed light on the darkest chapter of German history and the harsh realities of the Second World War. In this episode, we will analyze the Western Front of the war and the invasion of France. In the spring of 1940, Adolf Hitler was staying at the Berghof near Berchtesgaden, where this personal film was shot, probably by his mistress Eva Braun. A small gathering of adjutants, secretaries and former colleagues of the Führer gathered on the terrace. Behind these cheerful scenes it was known that there was a serious munitions crisis in Germany. That is, the concern of the top brass that there was not enough ammunition for the French campaign to be used in the coming Great War. This led to a crisis that questioned Hitler's leadership. And it was rumored that there was a crisis of leadership that even led to a coup d'état, which Hitler survived with a bit of luck. The attack on France was postponed 29 times. If it were not a coincidence, one might even say that this was a great trick of Hitler's. In this way the generals, so to speak, gradually got used to the fact that they were going to attack France first and foremost, and during this time the method of attack, the plan for the invasion of France, was constantly being refined, and during the spring of 1940 the confidence of the generals increased fundamentally, so that they began the offensive on the Western Front with a healthy self-confidence above all. Under the code Yellow Alert, the Blitzkrieg against France began on May 10, 1940. At the same time, the Wehrmacht invaded the neutral countries of Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. Although the Allies had more troops and twice as many artillery units as the Wehrmacht, the Germans were soon victorious on the Western Front as well as on the Eastern Front. As Charles de Gaulle later wrote in his memoirs, hundreds of thousands of French people fled to the south of the country within a week, thus sealing the fate of France. The soft policy of British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain was ultimately unsuccessful. On May 10, the day Germany attacked France, he suffered the consequences and resigned. His replacement, Winston Churchill, was known as a hardliner in the cabinet. In his view, Hitler's domination of Europe would mean that the whole world, including the United States, and everything known and loved, would tumble into the abyss of a new dark age. The new Prime Minister believed that Nazi Germany must be fought by any means necessary. Blood, sweat, toil and tears would be inevitable for the British on the road to victory. On May 14, 1940, German troops advancing towards France attacked the city of Rotterdam. The Dutch vainly defended their neutrality. Whatever the Luftwaffe has promised in Poland, it will fulfill in England and France, Hermann Göring declared, meaning that the enemy would also strike, crush and destroy here. Because Rotterdam did not surrender soon enough, the Luftwaffe bombed the city mercilessly and completely destroyed the city center. More than 800 people, mostly civilians, were killed in the bombardments, and the Netherlands agreed to surrender that same evening. The German invasion of France was fundamentally different from the invasion of Poland, despite many military similarities. The difference was that in the Polish occupation racism was part of the war. The invasion of France was in many ways a reenactment of the First World War. It was in a sense revenge for Versailles and the surrender at Compiègne. The Germans had devised a very daring and clever plan. Isolating the British and especially the French by luring them into Belgium was extremely risky, given the route through the Ardennes that other attacking troops would have to take. If the French troops had been able to get more support, if they had been able to deploy there immediately, the German army might have been in for a very nasty surprise. Since the German armored divisions had broken through the French front at Sedan on May 14, Wehrmacht troops had been moving rapidly inland. Only a month later the German army was in front of Paris. On June 18, the French government under Marshal Pétain called for an armistice. After the invasion, Hitler's chief pilot Hans Bauer filmed the remains of destroyed Allied aircraft, while the generals of the Luftwaffe, led by Hermann Göring's deputy Erhard Milch, rejoiced in the victory. From the beginning of the Western offensive, Hitler had settled into his headquarters at Eiffel. From Felsenist, Chief Pilot Bauer repeatedly flew Hitler to the front for briefings with Hermann Göring. Wounded German soldiers were brought to the airfield of Cambrai in northern France on June 2, 1940 to form the extras in the dictator's propaganda show. The Wehrmacht's losses were limited. About 30,000 German soldiers had been lost in the fighting. Meanwhile, German troops had surrounded hundreds of thousands of British and French soldiers in the small coastal town of Dunkirk. But Hitler gave the order to stop the advancing armored units. Why Hitler halted the advance of his tank troops has always been a matter of debate. The main reason was that the troops were advancing faster than expected and had to stop to resupply and maintain their vehicles. Hitler thought that the British would choose to negotiate because British troops were trapped at Dunkirk. This was a big mistake. When German troops captured the small town of Dunkirk on the English Channel on June 4, 1940, it became clear that they had failed to deliver the decisive blow. 400,000 British and French troops were besieged there. The British Corps had narrowly escaped disaster. Luftwaffe Chief Göring had promised Hitler that his aeroplanes would finish off the enemy. But despite the heavy bombardment, 200,000 British and 120,000 French troops were evacuated by ship across the English Channel at the last moment. Only in 1944 would they be able to return to avenge the deaths of their comrades. At dawn on June 28, 1940, Adolf Hitler inspected occupied Paris. 3 days earlier, France had surrendered. Hitler's chief architect Albert Speer wrote years later in his memoirs that the dictator had abandoned his plan to raise Paris at the last minute. Hitler is said to have told Albert Speer that, when we are finished in Berlin, Paris will only be a shadow. Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer, described his visit to the Invalids Cathedral as follows: he stood silently and reverently in front of Napoleon's sarcophagus. "This was the greatest and most beautiful moment of my life," Hitler said, deeply moved, when he had finally shaken off the magic aura. The dictator's lifelong dream had finally come true. But 5 years later the French would dance in the streets of Paris to celebrate the victory, and Berlin would be in ruins. For the French generals, the signing of the armistice agreement was a bitter moment. For the dictator had witnessed the subjugation of France on June 22. And Hitler had ordered the train carriage in which the Germans had been forced to accept defeat in the First World War in November 1918 to be brought to Compiègne, northeast of Paris, for this symbolic ceremony. The dictator was now at the height of his military power. This unexpectedly rapid success in the attack on France was exaggerated by Nazi propaganda as a lightning offensive. This was not in fact the operational plan of the German General Staff. The climax of the war was expected to take place in France in the spring of 1941. The fact that everything was over in 4 to 6 weeks, that a victory parade could be held in Paris 6 weeks later, was, from the general's point of view, the greatest achievement of German military history in the last 1,000 years. This was so incredible that the generals were initially very skeptical. They were even prepared to stage a coup d'état if necessary. But now they were to parade in Paris in an unexpected victory parade. They were intoxicated with victory. As Wehrmacht troops paraded through Paris, an American journalist wrote, "Paris is now the capital of uncertainty. Anyone who loves Paris and is saddened to see it so decayed is lucky not to see it as it is, because Paris will look disgusting to him." On July 6 Adolf Hitler returned to the Reich Chancellery building, having won a glorious victory. His supporters rejoiced. Wilhelm Keitel, commander-in-chief of the Wehrmacht, described Hitler as the greatest general of all time, while Minister of Propaganda Goebbels enthusiastically proclaimed, "Our people, our great people, the Führer, is walking over the flowers." The victory was celebrated for days by the German people, who greeted the soldiers returning from the front in a sea of flowers. Hitler handed out dozens of marshal staffs to his victorious generals. This was the height of his popularity both among the people and in the army. Now, we have come to the end of the second part of our documentary on World War II. Do not forget to subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so as not to miss the other parts. Goodbye, and see you again in the third part of our documentary.